Good afternoon, everybody. I hope you managed to find fresh air, if not a cup of tea. And it's been very exciting, this conference so far, and I'm very much looking forward to hearing our next speakers. The session that first of all, thank you very much for inviting me to chair this. This is a great privilege. The session defining the sacred landscape. We have two speakers, and I've just been delighted to be introduced to Bianca Lopez, who I'd like to just tell you a little bit about. She's the W.R. Nicholson Endowed Assistant Professor of Medieval and Renaissance Studies at Southern Methodist University, that's in Dallas, Texas. Some of you will know her first book, which is Queen of Sorrows, Grief and the State at a Marian Shrine After the Black Death. And that's a book that considers the rise of Marian devotion in late medieval Italy in terms of rural shrines dominating, that were dominant in urban religion right up until 1500 and thereafter. And she's received fellowships from all over the place, Fulbright Program, Ford Foundation, Gladys Kriegel-Delmas Foundation. And her second book is one she's just been telling me a little bit about, which is directly related to our theme today. And she's been working on it while she's CRIA Fellow at the Guidetti, where we're delighted that this whole occasion was thought up. And its title is The Migrant Plague Bearers of Late Medieval Italy, the Formation of a Minority Culture. So, you know, looking at the persecution, amongst other things, of migrants from the Eastern Adriatic as potential plague bearers. And I'm not going to queer her pitch here, because I'm sure we're going to hear some more about that in her talk. So, delighted to introduce Bianca Lopez, who's going to speak to bring together heaven and earth, regional, spiritual, and mundane economies at the Santa Maria di Loreto, 1379 to 1453. Thank you, Bianca.
Yes, so less migrants today, but more economy as devotion. So bear with me here as I give you an overview of this idea. In 1453, the same year that Ottoman forces successfully laid siege to Constantinople, the humanist Flavio Biondo described the marvelous things he encountered during his travels throughout Italy. In his Italia Illustrata, his famous geographical history of the peninsula, Biondo described one location in the March of Ancona, between Recanati and the Adriatic Sea, that proved Italy was a land made wealthy through love of Christian saints. In Recanati, wrote Biondo, there's a little church of the Virgin called Loreto, celebrated in all of Italy. And in that place, God granted the prayers of his supplicants through the intercession of his mother. Biondo went on to describe the favors that devotees asked of the Virgin, the blessings and cures she bestowed upon them, and the gifts they offered in return. The bishop, to the glory of God and the Virgin, hung the donations which were given after their faithful to be fulfilled, after their voting to be fulfilled, in gold, silver, wax, fabric, vestments of linen and wool, of great price, so as to fill the basilica. In this passage, Biondo referred to the gifts of the shrine left by those pious pilgrims, which in turn demonstrated God's miraculous presence at Loreto. Moreover, Biondo praised the local supernatural power of the region, describing its fame throughout the peninsula. In his description of the exchange of goods and coins for the hope that the Virgin would grant a miracle, Biondo made no mention of the Madonna's miraculous arrival at Loreto that we've been hearing about today, this sort of idea that the shrine itself is the birthplace of the Virgin Mary. No mention in this text of 1453. That fantastical narrative fits with modern popular notions of a medieval culture suffused with religious credulity and inclined to accept uncritically the reports of marvelous and miraculous occurrences. But between 1465 and 1473, so maybe a decade and a half later after this text, Pietro di Giorgio Tolomei, who we also learned about earlier today, the almskeeper and shrine guardian at Loreto, wrote a spectacular miracle story in which he asserted that the church under his care was actually the Virgin Mary's house, brought to Italy in 1296, almost 200 years previously. The story of the flying house, however, did not arise from any sort of notarial financial records, which provide our best glimpse into that earliest devotion at Loreto among ordinary people. From 1379, when the shrine first appears in the notarial record, which I'll be talking about today, to 1453, when it starts to disappear, so any kind of mention of Loreto in testaments and contracts and in people donations, land sales, mention of the Holy House, or not mention of the Holy House, but mention of Loreto starts to disseminate, actually to decline. These documents refer to the shrine only as Santa Maria di Loreto. During these decades, notarial records pertaining to the shrine and its lands do not use the word domus. They do not use the word, any kind of word related to any kind of a habitation in reference to the shrine, but only Ecclesia Santa Maria di Loreto. In producing his narrative, Terramano created an elaborate arrival story with angelic accompaniment, locating the shrine's legitimacy outside the local culture, financial and economic culture, as well as devotional cultures of March of Ancona. Even the shrine's later name of the Holy House obscures entire histories of communities of peoples that moved physically near the shrine from earlier decades, incorporating the shrine and its meaning locally into their lives, and connecting themselves financially to its patron Madonna in the hopes of receiving some sort of intercessory miracle to help not only themselves but those of their family members in purgatory. So since Terramano's account, scholars have struggled to explain why the identification of the shrine with the Virgin's birthplace appears so late, centuries after the first documentation of the shrine's presence. For the most part, I'm referring to economic historians here especially, but also historians of the church, have overlooked the more fictive elements of the humanist intervention, which they have explained as simply extending from a shadowy oral tradition. Even historians of economic activity, that tangible financial records that I've also engaged in my work at Loreto, have justified their arguments in this way. So even economic historians, justifying the presence of the Holy House through what must be an oral tradition. For instance, the Italian economic historian Marco Moroni, for him, the miraculous narrative of the flying house can only be understood within the cultural context of the second half of the 15th century, when the fall of Constantinople limited Christian pilgrimage to the Holy Land. Moroni also argues, however, that the legend of the house's foundation, as it appears in these sort of later manuscripts that mention that flying house, was based on a pre-existing local tradition that the humanists absorbed and then recounted. While the former statement that we need to understand the shrine within its local context is absolutely true, the second assertion that this later humanist and shrine keeper, Terramano, based his account on those of non-literate or semi-literate societies in the March of Ancona is impossible to prove and fails to explain the absence of any mention of the Holy House in the documentation surviving from before 1450. And when I say documentation, I'm really emphasizing these financial records. So while indications of an oral tradition pertaining to the Holy House do not appear in that extant earlier notarial evidence, these documents do provide information on the devotional activities initially present at the shrine, which were predominantly economic in nature. Okay, so here we have the basilica from outside, which we've seen before, a late 15th century print that we've also seen of the house's angelic flight, but also the location, the emphasis on the original building itself rather than a wider world. So this is also very important to Terramano. Okay, I'll get to these definitions in a second. So devotees approach the shrine through financial transactions, such as pious bequests and donations, which are formally notarized and stored in a notary's bottega. These first donations then led to gifts of land and real estate purchases near the shrine, resulting in a broad urbanization of those territories closest to Loreto. All of these actions were recorded in thousands of notarial protocols created between 1379 and afterwards. And these records demonstrate a rising urban lay devotion to Loreto, a rural shrine, and show how and why Mary mattered in the late 14th century. Instead of Mary's birthplace, we find instead a stone and brick church located on an isolated hill among a laurel grove, a sacred place that devotees travel to in hopes of receiving a miracle. The economic behaviors that motivated their physical movement towards the shrine give us the most intimate glimpse possible of individuals and families beckoning the Mother of God into their preparations for the afterlife. Tracing Marian bequests over multiple decades reveals that the shrines did in fact gain more coins and goods in nearby churches, that they dominated over other types of even lay religious collectivities like confraternities, that it became more popular than local parish churches, and this is all done through the sort of informal gifts given by these initial devotees. At Loreto, that informal ground-up economy, it prevailed and it was promoted by ordinary artisans and merchants and recanati until the papacy, after 1420, restructured the shrine's administration. Demographic and political transitions accompanied economic developments as a curial power structure absorbed the shrine in its wealth. I can't get into the papal history today, but would love to during the Q&A or informally afterwards of what happens after this sort of rise from ordinary devotion. So, these definitions. So today, the Holy House sits between the Mundane and Potenza rivers, overlooking fertile river valleys that drain from the Apennine Mountains to the west. In particular, the Potenza River was deep and wide enough to transport goods to Recanati, allowing for commerce to thrive at the bottom of the town's promontory. The river mouth created a sandy estuary and enticed the construction of a port for shipping wool and grain from the city to other Adriatic ports, both on the Italian peninsular side and on the eastern side. The river valley connected with the old Roman road of the Via Flaminia, which also served as a major thoroughfare into the late Middle Ages. Eventually, this byway could connect the medieval trader with Rome. Through Loreto, we talked a little bit about these, the sort of idea that you could stop at Loreto on your way through the peninsula, whether through trade or for pilgrimage. It became very popular by the end of the 15th century. Okay, so as made evident by Recanati's notarial contracts, the civic economy was intrinsically tied to the shrine's affairs, a history that traces back to before the Black Death. In many ways, economic activities at Loreto also tell the medieval financial success of Recanati's population. These two entities are not mutually exclusive. That Recanati, through plague, famine, and political strife, made the shrine its local sanctuary and place of devotion. I just wanted also to kind of go over a little bit this idea of a spiritual economy, a mundane economy, and what we see at Loreto. And there's a lot of scholarship on this, and a lot of it is vague, especially when it pertains to relationships with saints, with cults, with shrines in the Middle Ages. A spiritual economy, as I'm defining it here, is one in which you're not necessarily trucking in or exchanging or engaging in transactions with coins or goods, but rather with ideas and concepts such as intercession, as being saved, right? Basically consolation or forgiveness of sins. So it's more of these sort of concepts that are being traded with a spiritual or supernatural entity that pertains to a spiritual economy. A mundane economy, I'm defining as one in which you're engaging with that sort of tangible physical economy on the ground, the market economy, that of commodities and commercial enterprise, and where you are exchanging not only with barter, but also with cash. Okay, so at Loreto, I think what we see is a sort of like destruction of all that, the destruction of a dichotomy, of a binary between the spiritual and the mundane, and one in which we see the mundane being transmuted into the spiritual. And this is going to happen at different times and places, and it's really linked to crises. And this is not unique in the 15th century, in the Christian world, in the Latin Christian West, but it is very remarkable at Loreto that it can happen at all. And this pertains to that kind of informal lack of kind of political oversight of a real cash economy that allows for these things to happen. And it may sort of help us redefine what a spiritual economy or a mundane economy are at this time in the peninsula. Okay, so we have a map here to get you situated, but this should be clear by now. And some of these river valleys, right? The Potenza River to the south, the Mundane, which are wide and deep enough for commerce to prevail. Okay, so just to go forward a little bit to talk about this economy. So indeed, the town's Christian population invested the profits generated through commercial activity and inherited wealth into the shrine for spiritual reasons, transforming that cash and goods into prayers and votive requests. Ordinary pious bequests, devotional offerings, and pilgrimages helped usher along the regional sort of economic growth. Since Santa Maria di Loreto was located close to Recanati, the shrine's proximity meant that local residents could visit for ordinary concerns. It was common for Recanati's testator's to give their final gift to the Virgin in their testament, to be delivered by their executors and heirs. The testamentary language demonstrates how physical space was intrinsically important to the relationship testators had with the Virgin. These creators of wills themselves are often nearby residents who walked from Recanati to the shrine, but it was not necessary for them to be physically approximate to the shrine. They could send a bequest to it even if they were in the nearby town of Recanati, which is really is a half day's walk away. So testators themselves were also, they included artisans and merchants. One example is a woman named Domina Cucolina, the wife of Floriano Muccio of Recanati, who made arrangements to fulfill one last bequest to the Virgin. In her last will from 1390, a notary wrote, also, she leaves 1 ducat for a voto made at Santa Maria de Loreto. The statement refers to the shrine in a locative case, meaning that the request was made on site at Santa Maria de Loreto with the testator and the notary present. At the shrine, residents of Recanati would pray and ask for help, and the supplication was the voto. If that voto was fulfilled, then the pilgrim might opt to give the Virgin a gift, not necessarily as payment for services rendered, but as a voluntary offering. Testators depended upon these gifts to help ensure that the Virgin's assistance would continue into the future. In such a way, votive offerings successfully conveyed to the shrine an insurance policy, really, against the kind of disasters such as famines, floods, and plagues, and even war especially, that could befall a family, an ordinary family living in Recanati or outside of it. So although vows were seldom referred to in the notarial record, such pious actions indicate that these relationships with the Virgin, based on gifts and prayers, were commonplace. Someone might make a vow once they returned home from pilgrimage, or came home from war, or after a miraculous cure of a family member. Once a pilgrim returned home, the granting of the miracle would need to be followed by a countergift. So you would make the vow, the vow would be fulfilled. You'd come back home to Recanati, and then you would give thanks to the Virgin with another gift that would need to be notarized with a copy placed at the bottega, but also in the sort of underneath the communal the Palazzo Comunale at Recanati too. So all of these things had a paper trail that went into the civic arm of the law as well. So there are deep relationships between the sort of state of Recanati and the shrine before 1450. Okay. So in these cases, the willingness to make oneself physically approximate to the shrine preceded an economic behavior, such as giving coins, which I argue basically means that the spiritual might predate the economic, but it's the economic that leaves the trail, it leaves the evidence. And so we need to look at that and take it seriously, but also remember that the two go together, right? They're intertwined. Okay? A regional economic framework reveals the motivations and character of early devotions at the shrine and explains its enormous wealth by the early 15th century. From its initial rise, Loreto was the site of a regional economy imbued with mundane elements. While the March of Ancona was home to numerous commercial markets, the region lacked a formalized currency. The city of Ancona was sometimes subject to the papal yoke and at times not, and had a coinage through its own mint called the amiconitano. There's not elements here, but these are the sorts of coins. This is what an amiconitano would look like. Basically just a coin with either the Pope's image or one of a major sort of landmark in Ancona, and they were not worth very much. It was very difficult to make a valuation of these. Okay. Traders also used units of account, such as the libra and the florin, which were based on Florentine currency, as well as the bolognino of Bologna and the ducato d'oro from Venice, the golden ducat from Venice. There are also numerous coins of little worth used for alms and donations, and these were basically called black coinage, or piccoli, soldi piccoli. And it was very difficult as well to kind of make an evaluation in the March of Ancona for a kind of more standardized foreign currency. And so oftentimes when somebody was leaving a donation, it was impossible to know in any kind of real sense what exactly was being transferred. It's really in the spiritual sense that gave that gift any kind of meaning. Okay. So the Avignon papacy drew many curial administrators away from the march, leaving absent the position of legate and other local administrators. This is in the early 14th century, and in doing so also took away any kind of little economic and financial oversight over the town of Recanati and the environs outside of it and over Loreto itself. And so there's a period of absence here in which this sort of valuation or understanding of how much coins were worth became even more sparse. So the mundane in these cases, once again, came before the spiritual and came to make the spiritual more tangible. So archival sources such as testaments, receipts, and contracts containing in vivo donations so reveal not only the workings of the everyday economy, but also how pious acts interplayed with the mundane. In the March of Ancona, evidence supporting the existence of a regional spiritual economy included distribution of goods by both men and women. Furthermore, notarial protocols show how such goods connected households to nearby clergy and churches, solidifying the bonds between private domestic spaces and these institutions, but also providing charitable assistance for the poor. So depending on the coin at hand, no matter how small or insignificant, this allowed families to express their devotional wishes at the shrine through a tangible gift, which not only connected individual households to Loreto, but also imbued spiritual motivations into ordinary cash-in goods. And so here I have an example of just one of the many contracts and testaments that I've worked with since beginning my dissertation years ago, 2010. These things are very fragmentary. They provide very little information about the motivations or the wishes, the desires of the individual devotee to Loreto. All you really get is the mention of a voto, and I'm sorry I don't have a pointer. And in this case, you don't see that. You don't see here. All you see is the for the in fabrica in Cucuminie Ecclesiae Sancta Maria de Loreto, octo ducati d'oro. So this woman, it's actually a woman, is giving 8 ducats of gold to the Virgin, but with no motivation listed. Okay, so you have to surmise from the economic what exactly her spiritual intention was and how she was making those choices on the ground based on what coinage she had on hand. Did she have 8 ducats of gold on hand? Probably not. That's just a placeholder. It probably was made up of just household goods she had, parcels of land, maybe some beans, maybe some wine, whatever she could basically convince the notary to convince the shrine administrator to take. Okay, so there's these negotiations present for all these thousands of people leaving goods in the late 14th century, early 15th century. And just really briefly, I'd like to talk a little bit about the land market, because the way that this works is that, okay, you have thousands of people, many thousands of testaments over the years in an informal economic setting, providing the kind of economic basis and financial kind of endowment for the shrine, which allows it to then pick up more territory and more profit-producing agricultural arable lands to then turn a profit and create the sort of endowment that can profit off itself. And this is all before Martin V, so this is before 1420. But then what you start to see once you have enough of these sort of like individuals leaving gifts, you start to see the lands outside of the shrine get gobbled up by the shrine administration. And also you see individuals from Recanati move closer as well. So the lands nearest to Loreto urbanized in ways similar to other rural Marian shrines after 1348. But what you see here is a kind of even more encroaching of the shrine into the countryside, more so than at other sites in Italy, I would argue. So this process occurred even as Loreto lacked any overarching religious order directing its affairs. This is before the Franciscans come in. However, as Loreto became both the center of a local land market and target of increased town interest, the local bishop consolidated his control over the shrine by 1410. Regularizing the shrine's assets also included the assignment of a capelone priest to administer to the shrine's maintenance and lead public processions to and from the shrine. Loreto's keepers basically managed and expanded its territory, just as donations from the laity flowed in. By the mid-15th century, they counted on large amounts of funds generated through the selling of land donated and purchased at a low price, as well as through tithes in grain, wine, and olives. As time went on and profits from donations and land sales grew, the bishop, increasingly as well, the town priors of Recanati, fought amongst each other for greater territorial control near Loreto. So as urban residents donated their assets to the shrine, as all this is happening, they also began acquiring nearby lands. These parcels could then support buildings that could be rented out to other residents, dependent on Loreto's widening economic presence for spiritual and practical reasons. The earliest example I've seen of this goes back to 1379. A guy named Coluccio di Cola sold 2 parcels of land containing vineyards in the Contrada of Santa Maria de Loreto in her honor. The bishop arranged for the sale of these land parcels to two members of his family, Antonio and Nicola, who also own gardens and vines and orchards in the countryside. So these are people that are engaging in the real estate market. They're getting interested in Loreto, and they're incorporating those lands as well and dealing with the bishop. So as more town denizens venerated Loreto, they began to alter the shrine's territory through living in tighter densities around the site. So until the 14th century, the Contrada, or neighborhood of Loreto, had an infrequent presence in the documents, only receiving passing mention in inventories and charters. Resettlement near Loreto coincided with the shrine's growing estate, as areas closest to the shrine transitioned from rural fields to a developed and populated landscape. So just basically in conclusion, gifts disseminated into wider economic spheres in the region as shrine administrators. So I have testaments by year. This just shows that they're getting higher as not only as interest is catching on, but also as plagues hit. So plagues hit in 1383 with their spikes, 1390 and 1400, which ties to my argument that plagues drive these things up. And also just even month to month, if people are dying from plague at greater rates, testaments go up with bequests to Loreto also going up. Okay, and Loreto is also competing with other sites. The line in blue pertains to monasteries. The line in orange gives to Loreto. So you can see that overtaking traditional monasteries. Okay, and there's the territories. Okay, so pilgrims and other ordinary donors tapped into heavenly reciprocity through well-intended gifts of coins and household items. The shrine both acquired more territory and saw new residents purchase lands nearby, creating a more built and urbanized environment, resulting in an economy based more on pilgrimage and pilgrimage economy and sort of hospitality than through agricultural production. The melding of the mundane with the spiritual regionally shows the centrality of Marian devotion to economic behaviors in a world with limited papal oversight. So the wealth generated by the mundane economy and deposited into Loreto through devotees embedded the shrine into the surrounding temporal world and made it sort of more important to a wider regional economy. So the informal and non-standardized economic world of the March of Ancona brought about a different historical development than in other parts of the Italian peninsula. Rather than asserting the prevalence of a spiritual over mundane economy at Loreto, a regional framework allows for more grounded understanding of how heavenly and earthly behaviors interacted at different times, or heavenly and earthly expectations, really. Crises tended to intensify the transmuting of ordinary goods and cash into spiritual offerings, which could then be used for the shrine's maintenance or for pilgrims' welfare. The absence of a standardized currency opened up possibilities among nearby communities to support the shrine through offering of small change, inherited treasures, or arable land. And this was basically, they were free to do so because the papal oversight, which came in later, was not limiting them to say, okay, well, you have to make up, basically wealth to match the local currency or local, the Conetano or Carlino of Rome. So in particular, the land market surrounding the shrine represented evidence of the great wealth accumulated by requests for prayers, intercession, and other spiritual matters. The prevalence of combined mundane and spiritual economic activity allowed for the shrine's takeoff before it was absorbed into papal state-making. Here then too lies the connection between spiritual wishes, mundane goods and coins, and the development of the papal state. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Bianca. So many questions, very exciting. I'd like now to introduce Mattia Guidetti. He's Senior Assistant Professor at the Department of History and Cultures at the University of Bologna. He completed his doctorate at the University of Venice, Ca' Foscari, and has held postdoctoral fellowships at Harvard University, the Getty Institute, and the Kunsthistorisches Institut in Florence. And he's also taught Islamic art history at the University of Vienna and the University of Edinburgh. His prize-winning book, In the Shadow of the Church, The Building of Mosques in Early Medieval Syria, was published in 2017, and I'm very pleased to be able to announce what may not be known to everyone, but I understand his co-edited volume, which is just coming out with Routledge, is now available. called Rediscovering Objects from Islamic Lands in Enlightenment Europe, so directly related to some of the things he's going to be talking about today. That's co-edited with Isabel Dolet Saleh. Thank you very much, Mattia.
Well, my title is here on the screen. So thank you for such a kind introduction, and thank you to the organizers for having me today. So I'm an Islamic art historian. When I was researching Islamic objects in the Marche region, I came across the sanctuary of Loreto, which became prominent in my research. And basically, all of us, we know that Islamic world was related to the foundation of the shrine somehow. And in this paper, I will try to follow this connection in the following centuries. So we try to understand how Islam was present at the shrine in the following centuries. So I start by summing up the main elements connecting Loreto to the Islamic world. So the first, of course, is the foundation story, right? We know now. The foundation story of the Holy House, transported by angels from Nazareth to Dalmatia and from Dalmatia to Recanati and then to Loreto, emerges around the second half of the 15th century. The story dates the transfer of the House of the Virgin back to the end of the 13th century, when the last Crusader stronghold of Akka was lost by the Franks and the Holy Land returned in Muslim hands. The foundation story appears around the Islamic conquest of Constantinople, so this is something that has already been said, which, however, is an important point. And among the scholars who wrote on the regions of the foundation story, it was Bernard Hamilton, beside Marco Moroni, who stressed the tight connection between the Islamic conquest of Byzantium, of Constantinople, and the increasing migration of persons and objects, including relics, from the Eastern Mediterranean and from the Balkans to Catholic Europe and Catholic Italy, of course. So the second point is the fortification of the sanctuary. The transformation of the sanctuary into a fortress, into a city sanctuary, defended by massive fortifications, responded to the increasing pressures of the Ottomans, called by then the Turks, on the Adriatic Sea. The occupation of the city of Otranto in 1480 triggered around 3 centuries of continuous incursions of Ottoman-backed corsairs on the Italian Adriatic shore, and the concrete threat of a possible Ottoman invasion of the States of the Church. So the physical appearance of Loreto was shaped as a response to the presence of the Ottomans in the Adriatic Sea. The Adriatic Sea was defined by Fernando Marsili, an 18th century general, a frontier with the Ottomans. And in this perspective, the sanctuary worked as a physical outpost dominating the seashore, as well as a spiritual stronghold against the enemies. And here is another well-known depiction of Loreto, which is an Islamic depiction of Loreto. It's part of a well-known map of the Mediterranean, and Loreto is here depicted by Piri Reis as a fortified town or sanctuary. So on this basis, the sanctuary of Loreto became the recipient of ex voto donated by those who fought against the Turks. It occurred first with the Battle of Lepanto, with the visits paid to the sanctuary by both Marco Antonio Colonna and John of Austria, respectively the commandant of the Papal States troops and the Supreme General of the Holy League in Lepanto. The invocation of Maria Auxilium Christianorum entered the litanies of Loreto shortly after the Battle of Lepanto. There was also the symbolic donation of the chains by those who were freed by the Holy League from the Ottoman enslavement. And among the miracles performed by the Madonna of Loreto, there was the conversion of some Turks to Catholicism, as made evident by the documentary research carried out by Francesca Coltrinari and Vincenzo Lavenia. In terms of Marian iconography, it was often the Mary of the Rosary to become the holy figure to worship on the occurrence of war episodes against the Turks. And this is shown by the recent research by Giuseppe Capriotti on some paintings depicting the Madonna of the Rosario, together with some Turkish slaves. The image of Mary of the Rosary was also brought to the war, as shown, for instance, by this naval flag prepared for a member of the San Vitale family from the Parma region, belonging to the Order of Malta in the 17th century. So given this background, it's not surprising that Loreto became the addressee not only of a large Ottoman flag, which is the one that gives the title to my paper, but of numerous Turkenbeute, or Trofei Turkeschi. For several reasons, however, and most prominently the disappearance of most objects from the treasury of the Holy House, this aspect of the sanctuary was almost totally obliterated in the scholarship on Loreto. So the starting date of the arrival of Turkish trophies to Loreto was the year 1684, when a large banner conquered during the Battle of Parkani, which is today in Slovakia, was sent to Loreto. The flag measures 640 centimeters per 320 centimeters. It is made of silk and it's embroidered with threads of gold and colored silk. Its shape is rectangular with a triangular fly and consists of the juxtaposition of 3 bands with an additional border of 15 centimeters. The decoration includes the motif of the fleur-de-lis on the border of the flag, the representation of a double-bladed sword, a number of medallions of various sizes, and an epigraphic repertoire. The double-bladed sword, also called Dhu al-Fakar or Ali sword, is perhaps the most prominent element in the flag. It is long 180 centimeters and has a handle made of 2 knotted dragons and an 8-lobe medallion between the handle and the blades. The sword is characterized by inscriptions. One is running on the blades and presents the first 4 verses of the 48th chapter of the Quran, and the same quotation is also inscribed into the 2 vertical bands in the flag, where each verse is repeated twice. It is the Surah of the Victory, it's called the Surah of the Victory, a recurrent quotation of the Quran in the military art of the Ottoman Empire. A cartouche on the right side of the sword displays the sentence, "There is no sword but Dhu al-Fukar," a paraphrase of the Muslim motto, "There is no God but Allah," the first part of the Shahada, the testimony of faith of Islam. In sum, the banner was a huge object, lavishly decorated, one amongst the flags of the Circle of the Vizier, the commander-in-chief of the Ottoman army, sent by the Ottoman Sultan to conquer Central Europe in the 17th century. The banner was conquered during the Battle of Parkani, as I said, which is placed here. A site nearby Esztergom, on the way connecting Vienna to Budapest, or to Buda by then. In September 1683, the intervention of the Polish King John III Sobieski freed Vienna from the Ottoman siege, and on that occasion, 2 large flags were conquered. One was sent to Poland and another one to the Pope in Rome. And this was the one sent to Poland, and this one is the one sent to Rome. The first flag is today preserved in Krakow, while the second one, the one in Rome, was lost. The flag sent to Rome, however, is known through a publication that celebrated the conquest and donation of the flag to the Pope. And I'll come back to the theme of the publications of the flags later. A few months later, the liberation of Vienna, the battle in Parcani took place, and the Polish king decided to donate a third banner, conquered on that occasion, to the sanctuary of Loreto. And here is our banner. The shipment of the flag was, however, delayed. The flag was sent first to Poland, we don't know exactly for what reasons, and then only in the year 1684, so 1 year after, the package traveled to Italy. The details of the journey of the banner are preserved in the correspondence between Tommaso Talenti, the Italian secretary of the Polish King Sobieski, and the Cardinal Carlo Barberini, who by then was the protector of Poland at the papal court in Rome. A sort of negotiation took place because the Polish king asked for a visible display of the banner in the sanctuary of Loreto, and required an inscription explaining the nature of the ex voto of the banner to be added on the walls of the sanctuary. The journey of the flag from Poland to Loreto was a spectacular event, as it was the journey of the flag sent to the Pope 1 year before. Both banners symbolized the victory and were paraded in various towns during their journey. They were celebrated by both common people as well as admired by the members of the most important Italian families, such as is the case of Cosimo III of the Medici, who received the delegation transporting the banner at the Villa La Petraia outside Florence. The archives of the sanctuary of Loreto preserve a detailed account of the celebration that took place on the day of the arrival and donation of the banner to the Holy House. The celebration took place on the 15th of October 1684. Blank cannon shots greeted the arrival of the Ottoman flag in the square in front of the sanctuary. Accompanied by the bishop and the local authorities, the flag was officially donated as the main altar of the church. The precious ex voto was put on display within the church. More precisely, it stood on one of the pillars of the octagon that surrounded the marble casing erected to protect the Holy House and the likeness of the Virgin Mary. The banner was flanked by a marble inscription, which is still in situ, which is the one here on top, the one required by the Polish King John Sobieski, and the inscription testifies that among the ruins of the site of the Battle of Parcani, an image of the Virgin of Loreto was found after the battle, and a copy of the image allegedly found was sent to Loreto as well. So this finding, the finding of the picture of the depiction of the Virgin of Loreto, led to the decision to thank the Virgin of Loreto for the victory against the Ottomans by donating the banner to the sanctuary. I should now mention that the banner is no longer in Loreto. In the late 18th century, during the French occupation of the state of the church, a Polish general who fought for the French army took away the banner and had it sent to Poland. So the flag was first in Warsaw, then moved to St. Petersburg by the Russians, and then relocated in Krakow, where it is now. And in fact, today is part of the collection of the Museum of the Wawel Castle in Krakow, and is displayed on the ceiling of one of the rooms of the museum. The banner, therefore, remained in Loreto, in the sanctuary of Loreto, only from 1684 to 1798, so 114 years. We have several witnesses of the presence of the flag in Loreto, though unfortunately not any visual evidence, and I would be very happy to know if any one of you knows of any depiction of the flag into the sanctuary. Perhaps the most moving witness of the presence of the flag is the description offered by the widow of Sobieski, who visited the sanctuary in 1700. During her visit to the sanctuary, she stopped in front of the banner hanging over the Holy House and recalled the memory of her husband, the King John III Sobieski, the donor of the banner. Shortly after its arrival in the Papal States, Pope Innocent XI celebrated the conquest and donation of the banner by coining a commemorative medallion. The medallion has the Pope on the recto side and an accurate depiction of the banner, which is the one you see here, on the verso. The image on the verso displays all the necessary elements for a full appreciation of the nature of ex voto of the banner. On top there is a cartouche with the words Sub Tuum Presidium. Under the cartouche, among some clouds, it emerges the Holy House surmounted by the Virgin with Christ. And other than the Virgin, there is the banner, unfolded towards left and with the pole inserted into the ground. Under the flag, there is the scene of the battle. So on the right-hand side, the fortress of Parcani, and on the left-hand side, a handful of riders approaching the battleground. On the bottom of the medallion, a second cartouche offers further details on the conquest of the banner. The medallion sums up all the information that helped explaining not so much the Ottomanness of the banner was self-explanatory in this regard, but rather the circumstances and the people involved into the conquest of such a monumental object. It also clarifies its nature of ex voto, commemorating the protection offered by the Virgin of Loreto during such an important battle. Furthermore, following what had been done in Rome upon another flag arrival the year before, the local authorities in Loreto promoted some publications to illustrate the conquered banner and explain its iconography. The publications, to my knowledge, were three. One is a single leaflet, while the other two are lengthier pamphlets. In the case of the banner dispatched to Rome and exhibited in St. Peter, the one that was lost, the translation of the inscriptions were carried out by Ludovico Marracci, an expert of Oriental languages who was working on the translation and commentary of the Quran in those same years. Regarding the banner of Loreto, so our banner of today, the information are less certain, and I must say the translation much less accurate. It seems a couple of Arab Christians, so Maronites probably, participated into the deciphering of the inscriptions. Be that as it may, the publications are striking for the effort to present both the visual and material aspect of the object as well as its iconography. They include an etching of the banner and an accurate description of its parts, ranging from the size to the material the textile is made of, a short account of its conquest, a translation of the inscriptions, and a list of the iconographical elements that decorate the banner. The opuscules, the pamphlets, also contain an effort of interpretation. The double-bladed sword is said to symbolize the Ottoman dominion over the west and the east, while three rosettes among the many rosettes are said to represent the footprints of the horse of the Prophet Muhammad during his well-known ascension to the heaven. The publications do contain, however, some mistakes. The banner is said to consist, for instance, of camel's hairs, whereas it's made of silk. The translation of some passages of the inscription is not precise, and the explanation of the iconography is rather creative. Despite of these flaws, the publications represent an extraordinary effort to make sense of an extraneous object. The picture offered by the publications are also based on a scientific approach to the object. The picture is very precise, apart from the inscription, which are not readable in the image. The reason for such a treatment of the object, an approach that forecasts art historical publications, should be found in the subversive threat posed by the enormous banners taken from the enemy's army. And here I follow Sean Nelson and his recent work on the Medici and the Ottomans, that made some comments on the necessity to translate military objects once they arrive in Italian courts. Arabic inscriptions were everywhere in the Italian peninsula, but very often were on objects whose provenance provenance was forgotten or even unknown. The case of the monumental inscriptions on the Ottoman flags was instead rather different. To read inscriptions and make sense of the iconography was the final step of the process of appropriation of objects that had a sharply marked identity, such as weapons and military flags. The banner offered as an ex voto by John III Sobieski was the first of a series of Ottoman military objects that were given to Loreto. In the following 3 decades, other banners were sent to the sanctuary. Nothing survives, however, as well as Turks. And here you see one example of this category of objects, which is a pole with circularly arranged horse hairs of varying colors, a symbol of leadership and authority in the Ottoman societies. And this can be retraced in the archives at the sanctuary of Loreto. Furthermore, the arrival of the banner in Loreto had an impact on the surrounding area. And here I show you only one example. Other churches and sanctuaries followed Loreto and had an Ottoman flag donated as an ex voto. I mentioned here the sanctuary is not very well known, and the flags are unpublished, the banners are unpublished. Of the sanctuary of the Madonna della Rosa in Ostra, in the province of Ancona, in which 2 Ottoman flags were donated in 1717. By then, the primitive chapel was under refashioning. In 1726, the church was officially called sanctuary, and following Loreto, the early structure built around the holy image was incorporated into a new, larger structure. So the 2 Ottoman flags sent from the inland of Split in Dalmatia were included in the growing collection of ex voto of the sanctuary. The flags sent to sanctuaries back home dedicated a military victory to the intercession of the Virgin Mary, or local saints, into whose protection the soldiers put themselves. Besides the flags, dozens of ex voto remember the assistance provided by the Virgin Mary to prevent capture by the Turks. They often depicted maritime scenes in which the enemy's boats can be recognized thanks to the sailor's dress and the flags with the crescent. In other words, the large Ottoman flag of Loreto that I presented today is but the most prominent among a series of images, objects, and publications that testify the involvement of Loreto and the nearby region in the larger confrontation with the Ottoman world. Thank you.